must be a point where you say, why me?
My mom had to come into the prison and then leave me there every single time. All I wanted was to just go home so that I could have my life back.
You literally knew each other for this tiny blip in time, yet you are now welded together with this nightmare of a story.
It was the murder trial at the center of tabloids and headlines around the world.
It's being called the trial of the century in Italy.
American Amanda Knox convicted in Italy tonight.
20-year-old Amanda Knox, accused of murdering her roommate Meredith while studying abroad.
When you're in prison, you were either hyperventilating when you realised that you were in a cell, or you would look beyond the cell and realise that there was something outside of that.
There I was in a cell. I couldn't get out. It put my existence into perspective. I am a small piece of a bigger puzzle. I felt so miserably guilty that his life was horribly altered as a result of just knowing me. It is a privilege to have a daughter. It is a privilege that I thought at one time in my life when I was sentenced to 26 years in prison that was stolen from me.
We forget it at times, don't we, when the mundane kicks in and we sweat the small stuff. But then when something big happens, we're reminded that no day of our life will ever come again. Amanda Knox, welcome. We were just chatting earlier and I said we've got to press record on this because your story is so unbelievably interesting. You asked me, how do I remember your story or what was I doing in my life? And I can't remember, but I said to you that I was very much into following true crime and your story was massive in Australia and I do remember it. I didn't remember it, every piece of it, till I started obviously doing research and reading your book. But I want you to say how you just mentioned to me the difference between the first book you'd written and your new book, Free, My Search for Meaning.
Yeah, sure. Well, you mentioned that you don't really get into true crime anymore and you've moved on to personal development because true crime does have a lot of dark energy about it. There's something really like it just haunts you and follows you at the end of the day. And I really relate to that as somebody who helps people tell the story of the worst experience of their lives. I have to go, once I clock out for the day, I have to go listen to a bunch of Weird Al or something to just like balance out the universe in my mind. And it reminded me of how I think of the difference between my first memoir, Waiting to Be Heard, and this new memoir, Free, My Search for Meaning, because Waiting to Be Heard in a big way was just the story of this really bad thing that happened to me. And it was an important book to write because I felt that I needed to set the record straight and make sure that, there were facts on the table as opposed to misinformation. But ultimately, it was just a story of a really bad thing happening to me and how lost I felt in the midst of all of that. And this memoir is Free, My Search for Meaning is now about, okay, so this bad thing happened to you. Now what? So what? What is your place in the universe? How do you find meaning after having suffered? How do you find your place in the world after you have gone through something like that? And I think that that lends itself to a very different kind of energy for the reader. And I hope that ultimately what people get away from my new book is actually being able to empathize with my experience. Because I think in a way, my first book was really hard to empathize with because it was very specific about a very extreme set of circumstances. I was wrongly accused of a horrific rape and murder, and I went through a crazy trial, and that's a very unusual thing to have happen. And so I wonder if maybe my audience felt a little voyeuristic in sort of watching this unfold. And instead, what I really hope people come away with when they read Free, My Search for Meaning is to be really surprised by how much they can relate to my experience and how much they can see themselves in how I was processing a traumatic event in my life while also trying to live my life moving forward.
I mean, I just absolutely loved your book, and I think for the reasons you mentioned that you're able to have had honestly one of the most horrific things happen to you, and you're able to then look at that situation and think, how can I find meaning in this? How can I better myself and others through this experience, which is I think it's such an amazing thing. But just for people that don't know the story or don't understand what exactly happened, are you able to tell us a bit about what you were accused of, how that situation came to be, just so they are able to understand and follow on?
Yeah, yeah, and I also explain the context of all of this in my book, especially in the very introduction, explaining like, hey, this isn't the story of this wrongful conviction. This is my journey afterwards. But in order to appreciate what we're talking about, here are the facts. And so, in a nutshell, when I was 20 years old, I went to go study abroad in Perugia, Italy. I lived in a little cottage right next to the university with three other young women. And on the night of November 1st, about 5 or 6 weeks into my stay in Italy, a local burglar broke into our home. And it just so happened that only one of my roommates, my British roommate, Meredith Kircher, was home, and she was raped and murdered by the burglar, who then fled the country and was later identified by forensic evidence. But, this very unfortunately not uncommon kind of crime of a man taking advantage of a young woman in a vulnerable and studying abroad um, was cast in a very different light by the prosecution. From the get-go, detectives and I sort of put prosecutors and detectives in the same sentence, because in Italy, prosecutors lead the investigation, unlike they do in the United States. So there's more of a difference between detectives and prosecutors. In Italy, there isn't. So the prosecutors and detectives all assumed that things weren't as they seemed, that it wasn't a case of a simple break-in, that someone in the house was involved, and they really honed in on me, and they hypothesized that my roommate had died in a murder orgy, and that it was really what had really happened in their mind was there were two different kinds of women who were living in this house. There was the free-spirited, drug-addled American whore, and there was the more conservative, virginal and upright British girl, and we were in sexual conflict with each other. And so I orchestrated a orgy and then had two men hold down my roommate and allow me to stab her to death. That was the story. And I was in prison for 4 years. I was on trial for a total of 8 years, and it took all of that time for me to prove that I had absolutely nothing to do with the death of my roommate, and that the actual person who had committed this crime was a local burglar who had left his DNA all over the crime scene. And for those who, weren't around, this case made international headlines. It was persistently in the news again internationally for years, and I was very publicly vilified. I was given one of my soccer nicknames was Foxy Noxy, and it was recast in this very sinister light as this femme fatale seductress. And another nickname I was given was Luciferina. That was in Italy primarily. And again, this happened when I was 20 years old. My roommate was 21 when she was murdered. Very young people being cast in this morality tale, with victims and villains and heroes, very black and white. And it was an absurd story, but it took hold of the public imagination and persisted for years. And then, in the aftermath of all of that, even after, I've proven my innocence and been fully exonerated, it's not like the stigma of that goes away. I went from being an anonymous student to one of the most hated and vilified women on the planet. And I remain very much known for this horrible thing that happened to me. And I remain sort of defined by the fact that I was at one point in my life accused of murder. And I live with that to this day.
Do you believe in God?
I do not.
I
Although what I will say is it's interesting. My spiritual practice has evolved over the years. I was raised not really in a religious household, but I did go to religious schools. In particular, my high school was a Catholic high school. And I I kind of identified it as agnostic. I didn't really know what I believed at 20 because who knows what they believe at 20. And then once I was sort of put through this existential crisis experience that made no sense whatsoever and there was no justice to it whatsoever, I became very atheist. But my best friend in the prison was the prison chaplain, the Catholic chaplain, who I had many philosophical debates with, and he he always spoke to me in terms of his Catholic ideology, and sometimes that resonated with me and sometimes it didn't. And one thing that really did resonate with me was when he talked about the opportunity that God gives you in life, that when you pray for strength, God doesn't give you strength, he gives you the opportunity to be strong.
Mm.
And when he talked to me about that, it made me think, well, I don't have to believe in God to believe that in my life, the circumstances of my life are an opportunity for something. They are an opportunity for me to be my best self, regardless of what those circumstances are, and not just in spite of them, but because of them. And I then, since getting out of prison, I've taken up a meditation practice. I'm a member of my local Zen center. And so inadvertently, I became a church person because I now go to Zen church every Sunday to go meditate with my community. And I do a lot of reading in Stoicism, that kind of philosophy. So while God doesn't really enter into the equation for me, certainly the point of making meaning out of existence and seeing existence as an opportunity to live and to be one's best self is certainly a very strong part of my personal and spiritual ideology.
Yeah, the reason I ask, and I'm sure that you've thought this on hundreds and hundreds of occasions, is there must be a point where you say, why me? I am this girl that lived a humble life, didn't do anything wrong, very average in a great way, just went around doing my business. And I had this thrown upon me. And there are so many different characters in the story as well who had the same thing, where they were just innocent people going about their day. And next minute, they are vilified, put in prison, and made a mockery in front of the whole world for doing nothing.
Yeah. Or, I mean, the biggest example of that is what happened to Meredith. Meredith did everything right. She always got walked home like that. The night that she got murdered, she was walked home by her friends. So, like, it's not, you know, she did everything right, and still she was horrifically raped and murdered. And then I did everything right by calling the police and doing everything they told me to do, and I got put through this experience. So yeah, I definitely struggled with the problem of the just absolute unfairness um and nonsense of it all. Like it was one of the biggest things I think that put me in a different place than a lot of the other women that I was imprisoned with who were in fact guilty of the crimes that they had committed. Um, they knew why they were there, and there wasn't any confusion about. There might have been a sense of anger about it, right? Like a lot of these women had been victims of crime long before they had committed crimes themselves, and they certainly had, been thrust into the world in very unfair circumstances, poor, victims of abuse and neglect, all of that. But there was no like confusion about why they were in the prison themselves, or, none of them were in the spotlight under this horrific microscope the way I was. And so, yeah, especially when I got home, I really struggled with that reality, because when I was in prison, I often thought that my despair and my grief at least made sense, right? Like, I was in prison for a crime that I didn't commit. It made sense that I was deeply unhappy and deeply sad. Um, but then when I got home, I had imagined in the dark days in my cell that all I wanted was to just go home so that I could have my life back. I was living somebody else's life by mistake in this prison cell. I just wanted my life back. And then when I was finally given freedom, in quotes, freedom, I discovered that the life that I had been, you know, hoping for to return home to didn't exist anymore. That I was no longer an anonymous college student, that I was not just untouched by this experience that had happened to me. And and I not the world had changed and I had changed. And now I was put in this position where I felt very unhappy, I felt very angry, but it wasn't immediately clear to me what was the cause or what was the solution. Um, there's a chapter in my book where I talk about going to Burning Man of all places, and writing, like, sort of just journaling and painting about how pain was easier in prison because at the very least it made sense. And now here I was trapped in a life that I didn't deserve, that I didn't want to live, and I had to make sense of it and find the opportunity in it all over again.
What happened when you left prison to make you feel like that?
Well, I mean, first off, there was the fact that I was being stalked by paparazzi for months and years on end. I At those first several weeks of coming home, there were TV cameras camped outside of my mom's house. I couldn't go outside I couldn't open my window without being people mobbing me. And then in the years that followed, I was living in a constant state of paranoia, justified paranoia, because I would be minding my own business and then all of a sudden someone would come out of nowhere with a camera in my face and demanding to know if I had anything to say to Meredith's family, or like just out of the blue I would be just mobbed. And there was no, it felt like there was no rhyme or reason to it. I just didn't know when I didn't know I did couldn't felt I felt like I couldn't trust anyone. And as a result of that, I felt very paranoid and skittish. And then on top of that, I had been through this incredibly dramatic experience of having lived and survived 4 years in prison, and adapted to the lifestyle of prison. And then I come home and I realize that, first of all, I have a lot of repressed emotions that are coming out now that I'm no longer in a hostile world where I have to maintain absolute control constantly in order to survive. I'm suddenly very angry. I'm easily triggered, and I'm not the just happy-go-lucky, easygoing person that I used to be, that my family fought so hard to save. And I think I was struggling to figure out just how much I was irrevocably changed by my experience, and I was really struggling to figure out who I was all over again after this experience in a world that didn't seem to have a place for me. Um, it felt like not just when the trial was ongoing, because one factor that complicated things is after I was acquitted, I was retried again for the same crime. I was convicted again sentenced to even more time in prison and was facing extradition, and then was definitively exonerated by the Supreme Court in Italy. So 4 years in prison and then another 4 years of trial. And so that led to me feeling trapped and like I couldn't plant roots, and that I couldn't, I felt like I couldn't even get a pet cat because I was afraid that I might then be taken away, and what would happen to my cat. Like things like that were going through my mind. And so I'm going back to school and trying to get a degree, while at the same time having meetings with my attorneys about turning myself into the local authorities, in the hopes that they might let me serve out a prison sentence in the United States instead of shipping me back abroad. Like that was my reality as a 25-year-old. And then, after all of that, coming around to this idea that I'm no longer being hunted, and still facing that same problem of my identity being inextricably linked with the death of my roommate, and and sort of always being held up next to her as if my ongoing existence was an offense to her memory. Like I was absolutely given explicit and implicit messaging that I should shut up and disappear, that I was not a real victim, that everything that I had been through paled in comparison to what Meredith had been through, and therefore I just needed to count myself lucky and again shut up and disappear. That what I had been through didn't matter, and no one really cared what I had to say. And so I lived for a while. I wrote a memoir I wrote Waiting to Be Heard in that period of my life where I felt like I just needed to set some of the records straight about the facts of the case. But ultimately, I was living in a kind of self-imposed prison of feeling like all that I had, the only opportunity that I had in life was the opportunity to have to explain myself constantly to other people, and to justify my presence and my existence in a world that wanted to impose survivor's guilt by proxy onto me. And at the same time grappling with my own very real survivor's guilt of the absurdity, like grappling with the absurdity. Like even if I hadn't ever been wrongly accused and sent to prison and put on trial, all of that, like there was still the trauma of coming home one day and finding my house broken into and my roommate murdered. Like if none of that other stuff had happened, like I would still be grappling with that, and that would have been a life-defining traumatic moment for me that I might be in therapy for still to this day. And I think that the journey that I lay out in Free: My Search for Meaning is going from being very lost and very alone and almost flailing, making a lot of mistakes, trying to like find some kind of ground to stand on and some kind of connection with someone who would understand me, and making the mistakes and trusting the wrong people, to ultimately learning how to trust myself and how to think about how I can approach the world in a way that doesn't feel like I'm just reacting to a bad thing that's happening, but I am proactively self-determining. Again, not just in spite of what happened to me, but because of what happened to me.
In your time in prison, I know that you obviously read a lot, and that became, something that you obviously always enjoyed, but it became like, I suppose, going into other worlds of whatever you were reading, being able to learn a lot. And you read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is an amazing book, and I feel like I talk about it a lot on this podcast. But what in particular was it about that book that really, really stuck out to you?
I mean, there was a lot that stuck out to me in that book. Just the parallels it was the closest thing that I had to a How to Survive Prison manual, and even just his descriptions. So, of course, his book is in part a sort of memoir of his experiences in these horrific camps, and then a part of his philosophy in the aftermath of how to make meaning out of this ultimately existential experience, like what could feel like a very meaningless suffering experience, like meaningless death, meaningless suffering. How do you make meaning out of that? And there was certainly, it put into perspective my own experience, that it was not as traumatic as it could have been. Two, there were a lot of things that that resonated, even just with his descriptions about how certain guards behaved certain ways, or how certain prisoners would behave or think about their circumstances in ways that were either detrimental to their mental health and led to their demise, or that really grounded them and allowed them to push forward even in the most dire of circumstances. But I think just his observations about how do we frame the experiences that we've been through, what do we focus on, where do we find our sense of purpose and agency in the midst of a situation that seeks to deny us agency. I found that very, very powerful and empowering. And I've thought about it over and over again as I've cycled through these various stages of my life, even in the aftermath of prison, that feeling of feeling trapped in your own life, and that like you don't have a say over what happens to you, and that you're not living the life that you should have lived. Those recurring thoughts come back to me as I talk about stages of life, like becoming a mother was a rite of passage that I experienced also through the lens of this traumatic experience that I went through, where I was thinking about how, other moms get to do glamour pregnancy shots and post them on Facebook, and get to sort of be glamorous in their beautiful pregnancy. But I did not feel that I could do that, because I did not want the tabloids to be profiting off of the existence of my imminent daughter. And so I kept my pregnancy very private and very hidden throughout my pregnancy, and then was very strategic about publicly announcing the existence of my daughter, because I could not bear the thought that the first imprint of her existence in this sort of communal landscape would be a tabloid article that would basically shame her for existing, because the messaging I got was, who will never, Amanda gets to have a baby, who will never get to have a baby, Meredith. And like I just couldn't bear that would be the start of how anyone talked about her publicly. And so when I talk about all of those ideas about how your life should be in your mind and the life that you deserve to live, these are thoughts that happen to you in your mind because you're still grieving these traumatic moments in your life at even years later, because grief is a thing that you carry with you for the rest of your life, and it is a frame through which you are continually observing your life. And I think the trap is when that takes away from the preciousness of that moment, and the opportunity is when it really amplifies the preciousness of that moment. The very fact that I get to have a daughter is something that is so to reframe it, okay, fine, I didn't get to have my glamour shots and post them on Facebook, but you know what else I get that maybe a lot of people don't get, is the realization that it is a privilege to have a daughter. It is a privilege that I thought at one time in my life, when I was sentenced to 26 years in prison, that was stolen from me. And so at no point in my difficult, being a mom of now 2 little kids, do I ever regret being able to have had children. And I am always very, very aware of how precious every single moment with them is, because you never know when someone you love can be taken away.
Mm.
So
That's so true. I've learned that in my own life as well. And I think we forget it at times, don't we? When the mundane kicks in and
yeah.
we sweat the small stuff. But then when something big
Yes.
happens, we're reminded that, no day of our life will ever come again. And
Mhm.
when you have kids, that becomes even more real.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you focus on the things that you don't have instead of the things that you do. And I feel like for me, I'm never like I've been kicked so hard and I've been like knocked so low that I'm never ever I'm so grateful for this. I'm never ever unaware of the things that I have. I'm
Mm.
always focusing on how the glass is half full, because I've lived for such a prolonged period of my life needing to focus on that, or else I would just lose my mind.
When you're in prison, you, in the book, talk about this beautiful, it's kind of like a little bit of an analogy, but you say you were either hyperventilating when you realized that you were in a cell and you were caged in, or you would look beyond the cell and maybe see the
Mm.
glint of sun or whatever it was and realize that there was something outside of that. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so fun fact is I am claustrophobic. I always have
Yeah,
been.
same. So when you were talking about that, I was like, I actually felt like, oh my God.
Yeah. So being locked in a jail cell for 4 years came with its psychological challenges. And being trapped in a life that was very limiting came with, again, very many psychological challenges. But if it had to be reduced down to a metaphor, there I was in a cell. I couldn't get out, and I could focus on one of two things. I could stare at the door that I could not open, and 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 sort of cause myself extra sort of induce myself to suffer the reality of that existence, and feel the anxiety and dread and grief that comes with focusing on that element of my current circumstance. Or I could pivot my gaze and look out the window that, yes, also had bars that I could not get out of, but through which I could see the hills that were, dotted with cypress trees and a bell tower. And if I looked really closely, I could see rabbits running across the fields. And I taught myself to focus on those things, because with them came a sense of relief. It relieved that feeling of claustrophobia, that there was something bigger to my existence than just what my physical body was limited to. But also, again, it put my existence into perspective. I am a small piece of a bigger puzzle. And yeah, and I think that I look at that today, to this day, when I look at around me, what looks like a door that I'm always looking for windows that can convey to me a sense of opportunity, instead of all the closed doors that I find around me.
Giuliano, he led the investigation as the prosecutor. Do you actually believe that he thought you were guilty?
I think that he believed in himself. And what do I mean by that? I think that he, like so many of us, had a vision of himself that he believed in, which was a logical yet intuitive um, champion of justice. I mean, he went into prosecuting in order to serve justice, which to him is a sacred principle. And I say that because I now know him. I've spent years talking to him and being very open with him and him very open with me. And I understand him now as someone who very much believes in himself. And as a result of that, he believes that he was logical in his assessment of the facts of the case. And I do believe that at no point in his persecution of me did he knowingly persecute what he knew to be an innocent person. I think that he believed in his theory. And he has a book about how he developed his theory, but it first and foremost came down to his belief that the crime was not as it seemed. And this goes back to him and having a long history of being interested in conspiracy. He is in his career, he has gone after mafia and also investigated serial killers, assuming that there was some kind of local corruption involved in the case. And so he tends to see things as there being some kind of underlying conspiracy. And he was biased towards that kind of perception of reality. And so when he saw that there was a break-in into my house and that a girl had been raped and murdered, he did not just immediately assume that there was someone broke into our house and raped and murdered my roommate. He assumed that there was something more going on, something secret. And so he looked for evidence of that. This is called confirmation bias. It's where you assume something based upon a gut instinct, and then that leads you to perceive facts in a certain light in order to confirm what you already believe. And that led him to some absurd conclusions that I think are a sign of negligence on his part. Like, a big thing that his theory relied on was the idea that I was in a three-way relationship with my boyfriend of 5 days and this local burglar who actually committed the crime. And there was never any evidence of this. That I didn't even know this burglar's name. I had seen him around once or twice because Bruges is a small town, and I did not have his phone number. No one ever saw us together. Like, there was just literally no evidence of this idea of me having a relationship with him. And yet his entire theory came down to this local burglar being emotionally devoted to me and willing to do anything to please me, including rape and murder. And he now recognizes that, and he admits to me that he could have been wrong about some things, but he still believes in himself as a logical thinker, as a rational person, and as someone who is dutiful to the law. And that puts me in a really interesting position, challenging position, because for me, I really do believe him that that's his experience of reality, that he truly believed what he put forth to the world. And I think that that is more true of wrongful convictions than we'd like to think. I think we like to think that there are bad actors who are willing to frame innocent people, and if we just uproot them out of the criminal justice system, wrongful convictions won't be a thing. I think the more insidious truth is that a lot of law enforcement professionals and detectives and prosecutors are very much like my own prosecutor. They believe in themselves, and therefore they believe that whatever theory they come up with is just and true, even though it is wrong and unjust and incredibly harmful. And for me to have a relationship with this person has really been a kind of psychological experiment. Um, I I I've learned, I think that part of the reason why my prosecutor was unable to recognize my humanity over the course of the trials was in part because of the adversarial system that we were entrapped in. Like, like he was my prosecutor, I was a defendant, and sort of as a duty, he was sort of compelled to view me in the worst possible light and to refute anything that my defense claimed, and really like hold two different versions of facts and reality in the courtroom, and to tell a story to a jury, and try to convey, like try to sway that jury from these two very different realities. And I really wanted to know if there was a way for us to find any kind of common ground outside of that adversarial system. And at the beginning, I really hoped that in doing so, he would realize that he was wrong, and he would realize that he had hurt me, and that he would do whatever he could to make amends, and he would tell the world that I was innocent. Like, of course, I had fantasies of that. But over the course of my correspondence with him, and then my meeting with him and developing a relationship with him, I realized that that wasn't my goal, really. My goal wasn't to be okay through him. It wasn't to, I didn't want my well-being to depend upon him figuring it out and making it right. Instead, I realized that I had been at his mercy for the formative years of my life, my entire adult life. And I now asked myself, well, what can I do? How can I show up? What do I have to give? And what I found was that he was much more at my mercy than I ever realized. That very much he was moved by my desire to recognize his humanity and his good intentions. And he never expected that. And he didn't even know that he needed it. But in receiving it, he felt absolved.
Did he ever say sorry to you?
He did not say, "I'm sorry." What he said was, "You are not the person that I thought I was prosecuting, and I could have made mistakes." But even more than what he said or didn't say was the way he acted. I I know my mom talks about this as, it's too little, too late. Um, whatever he's giving you is meaningless because it doesn't actually do anything to undo the damage that he did to my life. But I really believe in holding people where they are. Like, I came out of nowhere for my prosecutor by being kind to him and reaching out to him. I had spent years sort of preparing myself to witness his humanity and to hold his humanity gently. He was not prepared for me. And he was not prepared for me to have that strength. And so instead of holding him to account for what he has not been able to do, I instead really appreciate what he has been able to do. Like, when I went to visit him, we talked for like 3 hours, and the entire time he held my hand. And he brought a gift for my daughter. And, now to this day, he sends me text messages every day. And and they are full of his appreciation for my humanity. And who knows? You never know what's going to happen in life. I know that I'm not waiting for anything anymore. I know that I'm exactly where I need to be, and I'm doing exactly what I need to do. And I am at peace with that.
You chose to forgive him. How did you find the strength to do that?
It's funny, I didn't set out to forgive him. I set out to understand him because, again, I was plagued by that why question. Why did this happen to me? Why did he do this to me? And over the course of years of correspondence and meeting in person, I came to recognize a real human being who was very strong in some ways and very weak in others. And I felt that in spite of himself, I really do feel like if you put yourself in a position to just witness somebody, they will reveal themselves to you, whether they want to or not. And whether he wanted to or not, Giuliano revealed himself to me in all his trembling nakedness. And when you are witness to someone in that state of vulnerability, you can't help but want to hold them gently, to feel the preciousness of their humanity. And I feel that compassion and forgiveness are sort of inevitable consequences of that.
You talk about Raffaella, who was your boyfriend for 5 days. I mean, he is just this other poor pawn in this terrible nightmare, in this terrible game. He didn't get the attention that you got, and he got the sentence in prison. I mean, whatever happened to him? This is, when I was doing research for this interview, I was thinking, life has brought these people together, honestly, who barely know each other.
Mm-hmm.
From Meredith to Raffaella to all the other people within the story. It wasn't like these are lifelong friends and you grew up together and then this bad thing happened. You were literally knew each other for this tiny, tiny blip in time. Yet you are now welded together with this nightmare of a story. How is he and how has he moved through this situation?
Great question. There's a chapter in my book where I talk about also meeting him again in Italy and taking a little trip with him that we had intended to take the day that I came home and discovered that my house had been broken into and all of that. So we never really got to go on our romantic little weekend. And we finally did after all these years. And it was bittersweet because in a way, part of this story is a love story cut short. I was very hyper aware that he was pushing my baby's stroller and it was not his baby. Who knows what it might have happened if this man hadn't broken into my home and murdered my roommate. Maybe, Raffaele and I would have gotten married and had kids and who knows. And I looked at him and here I am with a husband and a daughter and this mission and this sense of purpose. And he didn't have any of that. He was still struggling with bearing the weight of the stigma of the accusation, and he was still finding himself very isolated and very angry and, you know, not in a stable relationship with anyone, and having struggled for years and years and years to have a stable career. Today he's doing much better. He has his own personal computer engineering business, and he has a new girlfriend, and they just recently went to Disneyland for his birthday. Um, and he and I have actually reconnected in a big way, because in the immediacy after getting out of prison, um, we kind of went our separate ways, especially on my end, because I felt so miserably guilty that his life was horribly altered as a result of just knowing me. I was very lucky to have met him, because I met him 5 days before this murder occurred, and I was at his house when my house was broken into. And so I was not there, and I did not become a victim of Rudy Gaday's crime. And so I was very lucky to have met this person, but he was very unlucky. He never would have been, drawn into this case if it weren't for the fact that he was my alibi. And you're right, like, he was Mr. Nobody over the course of the trial. No one seemed to care about him, that he had no motive, he had no history of violence, that he had no connection to the person who actually committed this crime. Like, nobody seemed to care about that. And they punished him anyway, and they vilified him anyway. And then he, lived in Italy. He was Italian, so like the stigma of that was very strong and persistent in Italy. And we actually reconnected recently to talk about how we have been trying to make sense of it all, and how we have managed the terrible grief that comes with this persistent, ongoing trauma that doesn't really have resolution. And we both were sort of surprised to discover that we're both big meditators. And I think that he's really finding his way and his footing now, but it's taken him a lot longer than me.
Why do you think?
Well, testosterone, maybe, because I think that his experience of anger is much stronger than mine. I'm a lover, not a fighter, and I think that he has felt very frustrated by how, even though we won the case, we didn't win the war, right? Like, he's not been really truly vindicated in the eyes of the world as being completely innocent. There's still that lingering sense of doubt. There's still that stigma, and the damage is done and can't be undone. And I think that he has really struggled with the feeling of impotence in the face of that, and the unfairness of it. I think he's really struggled with the unfairness of it. And I feel like I've maybe felt more in peace, or at peace, with the paradox of existence, which requires one to accept injustice as just a part of our reality. That, again, we do not get the life that we should live. We get the life that we do live. And we don't get what we deserve. We just get what we get. And you make the best of it.
The media were vicious, very vicious. And they, as we mentioned earlier, they used you as characters. And as you mentioned, they called you Foxy Knoxy, and they built a persona around you that just was not true at all. what have you learnt about the media? Have any reached out to you to say, I'm sorry? Or, I mean, how are they now to you so many years later?
No one I guess it's funny. Some people in the media, I've received more apologies from people not in the media than people who are actually in the media. Like, no one who is ever directly involved in the media and the misrepresentation of me has ever reached out to me to apologize. In the same way that no one who persecuted me and put me in prison ever reached out to me to apologize. But who has reached out to me and apologized is so interesting. There was a model who I interviewed on my podcast Labyrinths who reached out to me on Instagram, of all places, just to say, like, hey, you probably don't even know this is a thing, but back when you were on trial, Vice, magazine hired me to do a photo shoot that was for a fashion design, but it was like Amanda Knox themed. And so it was like I was pretending to be you in like prison or holding a meat cleaver and covered in blood. And she was like, it was just a paid gig and I didn't even know what it was until I showed up. And she said, and I've been haunted by that to this day, that like she, as a very young model who was just doing gigs whenever she could, participated in her small way in the vilification of me. And she just hated herself for it. And it was really wonderful. And it was a beautiful opportunity for me to like sort of grieve alongside her of how like the badness of a lot of like older men's choices had led to the degradation of young women, both her and me. And I think that something that the media has yet to learn is that just because something sells doesn't mean that it's fit to print. And that idea of women in constant sexual competition with each other, ever at odds with each other, never capable of true friendship, of pitting women against other women, that idea that is so sticky and persistent across all cultures, it seems, and especially in the media, is a recurrent narrative that we see the media present to us over and over and over again. But it is not true, and it is not fit to print. It is profitable. And I think the media should take a long, hard look at itself and ask itself if the economics of the media are at odds with its integrity and with its purpose.
Your parents would have gone through hell and back. And I wonder how they navigated that time when you're in prison. I know that you are close to your mother. And as a mother now, I mean, can you imagine having your child locked up unfairly in prison and not being able to do so much about it? Yeah. How did she move through that?
Yeah, so my mom there's these through lines in my book, and the two main characters who I have a relationship that evolves over the course of my book is Giuliano, my prosecutor, and Etta, my mom. And my mom has always been my biggest champion, my greatest cheerleader, a firm believer in just me and my place in the world. And she absolutely went through worse of an experience than me. And I really only truly understood that when I gave birth to my daughter and realized that she was going to experience pain and I couldn't take that pain away from her. That I could not just take her pain and put it on myself. And the impulse of wanting to do that was so strong and deep and existential. My mom had to come into the prison to visit me and then leave me there every single time, and had to forfeit and give up and make sacrifices over and over and over again to support me and to help me navigate a system that just seemed deeply, deeply unfair and cruel and dehumanizing. And then when she came out, she struggled with the fact that in some ways she couldn't help me because she didn't know how to help me. There is no guidebook for how to survive after being globally vilified and sexualized and objectified. Like there's no guidebook, and my mom didn't really know how to help me. And then as I found my way again, my decisions to find my way again went at odds with her instincts. My talking to Giuliano, my prosecutor, she could not understand what purpose that could serve, and she did not trust him. And so my decision to go back to Italy to meet with him, everything in her body told her that that was wrong and she needed to protect me from that. But also she couldn't stop me on, like, she didn't want to stop me on my own journey of self-realization. And so all she could do was accompany me to support me. And we had a really beautiful moment in the aftermath of meeting with Giuliano where I told her everything that had happened, and she was just so mad, still so mad at him and his failure to do the right thing in her mind. And I had to remind her that it wasn't about him. It wasn't about what he did. It was about me and what I did, and that I wanted her to be proud of me, not disappointed in him. And that really, my mom came around to that. But like, I understand her pain as a mother whose daughter has been so harmed, and not being capable of cradling the person who harmed, accepting the person who harmed her daughter in the way that her daughter did. So yeah, my mom's journey has been, I keep telling her that she should write her own book, and she's just like, no, I lived it. That was bad enough. So
Meredith's family, do they have contact with you? Have they spoken to you? I know her parents have died, but her siblings?
no, unfortunately not. They haven't responded to my few moments of outreach to them. I've not been very persistent in asking them to have some kind of communication with me, because I'm sensitive to the fact that despite the fact that I had nothing to do with Meredith's death, they still associate me with Meredith's death. And so I don't want to pressure them to confront their own, worst tragedy just to have a relationship with me. But it is a raw point for me. It's an unhealed wound for me that that they don't hold me worthy of consideration. And maybe that's just because it's too painful. But a part of me wonders if it's just because they can't shake the false narrative that was presented about me.
And our final question, what is a life of greatness to you?
A life of greatness comes from seeing your reality clearly for what it is, and seeing that you have every possibility of being the best version of yourself that you can be within it. I talk a lot in my book about the various ways in moments, both in prison and out of prison, that I realized that I had something very valuable to offer to other people and to the world, and that my life mattered. And I think that a life of greatness is really recognizing how your life matters and putting it to work.
Amanda Knox, it's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you today. You have just really got so much wisdom through such a horrid situation, and I thank you for turning something that was very painful for so many of you into something that can help so many people. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.